Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of conversations with leading scholars in the field. With me today, it's a special delight to welcome Shibley Telhami, who's the Anwar Sadat Professor at the University of Maryland, and more importantly, my dissertation advisor from Cornell. So Shibley, welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Shibley has a really outstanding new book out. It's called The World Through Arab Eyes. It just came out very recently, and I thought that we would talk about that. This is based on over a decade of polling research, and I think it deserves to be read. So, Shibley, tell us about the book.
Well, thanks. It's interesting you're mentioning me as your dissertation advisor, and I want to start actually by remembering my dissertation advisor who just passed away, Kenneth Waltz, who, as you know, was a giant in the field. People who agreed or disagreed with him couldn't ignore him. And clearly he's a loss, whether you agreed with him or not. You know how much of an impact he had on the field. But I start with that for another reason. Because, when people think of me as a scholar studying public opinion, they have no sense of the roots of focusing on power and sovereignty and realism, coming out of a school of thought that focused on that and seemingly, according to a lot of stereotypes, ignored the role of domestic politics and ignored the role of public opinion.
When I met you at Cornell, you were a realist.
Well, I was a realist, but even in my first book, which was my dissertation, was sort of power and leadership in international bargaining, trying to talk about the different aspects that come into play. But actually, that's a good place to start because I arrived at Cornell. That's the time I was going through a transition. And it really started just before I arrived at Cornell. It was 1990. I was an advisor to Congressman Lee Hamilton, who was then the chair of the House Subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East. And he had, I was an international affairs fellow assigned to him. And so this is the year that the Cold War ended. And in the spring of that year, I go into the Middle East to write a report on the impact of the end of the Cold War on, globally and on the region. And among other things, I go to Iraq. Among other places, I go to Iraq. And while in Iraq, I'm hosted by then Ambassador April Glaspie. And she asked me to join her at a diplomatic dinner where we learned that Yasser Arafat was still in Baghdad. And there was no dialogue at the time between the PLO and the US. So she suggested that it would be a good idea for me to meet him, if possible, so I can maybe tell him about where Congress is on this issue and where perhaps he would send some message to Congress. And during that, a meeting was arranged the next morning by the Egyptian ambassador. And when I met with Arafat that day, one thing that struck me, because I had already kind of documented we didn't have scientific polls at all at the time, but I'm talking to people, academics, journalists, ordinary people, officials, and I'm piecing together a very angry environment with the United States. In fact, in my report, when I wrote back, I wrote a report saying that the level of anger with the US in early 1990 was comparable to the aftermath of the Suez Crisis in 1956. That's pretty strong language. Of course, I had no scientific information. It was just sort of impressionistic reading, talking to people. Now, Arafat told me something interesting that stuck with me, and I started analyzing it a little bit, and that was that he believed that all the pro-American Arab rulers were not popular enough. And he gave me an example about King Fahd being undermined by the public in Medina. And then he talked about how Saddam Hussein was actually popular. And so this was part of the kind of a narrative that he really genuinely believed. And later, by the way, since then we found out Saddam Hussein genuinely believed. It wasn't just sort of made up. When I came back, obviously the Iraq invaded Kuwait. That was not anticipated. And then we know what happened. And then there were consequences, but not the sort of consequences that people anticipated. Saudi Arabia invites American troops on its soil. The king stays, and obviously not a big factor. But at the same time, the king of Jordan, who was arguably the most pro-American of all Arab rulers, ended up going against the U.S. because of his public opinion. So we had those two really very different kinds of reactions. And so that was really kind of the question for me. There's no doubt that Arab rulers think Arab public opinion matters, and we know historically it does even in authoritarian regimes. But in what way? I started writing, as you know, I wrote some articles related to that about Arab public opinion in the Gulf War, what happened afterwards. But one thing I really was uncertain about is not only in what way is Arab public opinion important, if it is at all, but whether in fact I was actually documenting public opinion. I mean, I had no idea because we were basically, it was impressionistic. You know, of course we're documenting elites, we know that. We're documenting a narrative, but we don't know. And so that's the time when Al Jazeera comes into play. And suddenly the conversation opens up, and you have this two things coming into play. A more open expression of public opinion displayed in the media, and a revolution in the information arena that we knew were going to have consequences for politics, for opinion, for identity, for everything else. So what I envisioned from that day, I started a project to have a long-term study that measures how this information revolution is changing the media habits of the public, number one, and secondarily, how it is shaping or helping shape or influencing how people identify themselves, who they are, their identities. And thirdly, how in turn it is or it's not influencing their opinion on issues. So the project really was, you know, you can look at it as a 20-year project, but 10 years of public opinion polling as such to kind of reflect on this relationship between information, identity, and opinion in the Middle East.
Now, you've been surveying the same 6 countries for 10 years now. What, if any, are the major changes that you've seen?
Well, there are a lot, but let me make 2 points. At one point, I think wouldn't surprise you personally, because I think it would be a jive with what you might anticipate and something we talked about in the past. And that is that when you look at the decade, there is no question that there has been erosion of identification with the state across the board in the 6 countries. So we see that there is a trend of decline across the board.
You mean a decline in national identification?
And national identification with the state. We also see that some of that is probably related to the information revolution of the transnational media that is, in our finding, is not necessarily the cause, because I think people self-select. And Al Jazeera's initial strength was the fact that it understood the identity of its audience more than shaped it. Right. But there's a reinforcing part. And so we find that there's reinforcement. The second thing is that the threat factor of the decade, particularly the sense that the U.S. was confronting Muslims, as someone said, you are often what you have to defend. And in some ways, we can see an increase in Islamic identity, even separate from an increase of membership of organizations or religious groups. So that's one of the things that's very evident in the results. But one thing I would say about the pre- and post-Arab uprisings is that surprisingly, there's not significant difference in places like Egypt, on attitudes on issues like the Arab-Israeli conflict, like attitudes toward the United States, like attitudes toward Iran, attitudes toward the role of religion, that remarkably what we were finding before the uprisings was relatively consistent with the post-uprisings.
Now, when a lot of what you've written has been about anti-Americanism and public diplomacy and how the United States might deal with this public opinion, after writing the book and thinking this through, I mean, what do you now think is possible? Are these views so entrenched at this point that there's basically nothing that the United States can do, or are there significant things or conceivable things which the United States might effectively do?
As you know, I served on this nonpartisan commission on public diplomacy, and even that consensus report said that most of the attitudes are not related to public diplomacy. You might be able to influence things on the margin. What I find here, of course, is that America is evaluated principally over policies, and really two issues more than any. One is the Palestine question, which I call the prism of pain through which Arabs view the world, but secondarily, the presence of American forces in the Gulf. And those trump everything else. But I would go a step further.
In the Gulf, not Iraq?
No, yes, absolutely, not Iraq. It's in the Gulf broadly, that the presence of American forces in the region is not popular. I mean, you know, obviously governments, many governments want it there for stability, and some of the elites do. But by and large, public opinion, certainly not necessarily in these countries like the UAE or Qatar, I'm talking about in the six countries broadly, especially in Egypt. But separate from that, when you look at this notion that was tried initially in the Bush administration, which is, let's just tell them how good we are. Let's put, instead of all this negative stuff they're getting from Al Jazeera or somebody else or the events on the ground, let's put some positive stuff, positive reporting about the U.S. I have an experiment here that I do. I have a chapter on the extent to which people can empathize with the other when there's conflict, and whether you can fight incitement when you have conflict. Mm-hmm. What we find is when people don't believe the conflict is resolvable, when they think conflict is inevitable, they are not likely to empathize. And when you put some positive material about the other in front of them, they react exactly the opposite of what is intended. We found that also among Israelis and Arabs, how they react to the civilian casualties of conflict. Arabs will say, instead of saying, I empathize with those casualties, they will say, they have a feeling of revenge. Israelis will say, they deserve what they got, or they brought it upon themselves. So we find that really, when people make an assessment that conflict is inevitable, when they make an assumption about the intentions of the other side, when there is deep mistrust, it is impossible to fight this or to get them to empathize simply by public diplomacy or positive material or a counter-narrative. That counter-narrative is rejected. And more than it is rejected, it sometimes gets exactly the opposite reaction that's intended. It's resented.
You coined that, I think, very evocative phrase, the prism of pain. But with everything that's happened in the region, from the war on terror, Iraq, Syria, the uprisings, have you been able to track any changes in the extent to which the Palestinian issue is at the center of these Arab identities and concerns, or does it continue to be as salient as ever? I mean, what shows up in your polling?
It's as salient as ever, but let's put it in perspective. I'll make a couple of points on it. Perspective number one, the Palestine question is never the first question for Arabs in their daily lives. It never is. It never has been. I mean, separate from governments, we could talk about governments. Of course, what they're interested in is keeping themselves in power. But when an Egyptian wakes up in the morning, she wants to get food on the table for her kids or send her kids to school, and they have to worry about jobs and marriage and life. And the Palestine question isn't the issue that is before the uprisings or since the uprisings. Obviously now people are preoccupied even more with their immediate situation. People have to fight for the literal livelihood. But what it is the prism through which they evaluate the outside world, and particularly the United States. So there's the shortcut when you ask them, do you like the US or don't you? Do you like Venezuela or don't you? Do you like Turkey or don't you? Much of the prism that they use relates to this issue of Palestine, because I show and I argue that it is built into notions of Arab identity that are very difficult to separate. And that despite the Arab uprisings, what we find is that when you ask people, do you want your government to serve the interests of its citizens, or do you want the government to serve the interests of Arabs and Muslims broadly? You get half or more in every country say, serve the interests of Arabs and Muslims broadly. And that tells you something about it.
What about, say, Syria? For example, is there a prospect that Syria might become that prism by which Arabs would evaluate the United States or the outside world? Or do you see that the Palestine issue is so central to their identity and narrative that everything else will come and go, but Palestine will essentially remain?
I think that it's not only Syria. Look at Iraq. I mean, Iraq, we already have had, an incredibly painful history, certainly since 1980. I mean, that is a pretty extended history of bloodshed and suffering and destruction and so forth. And it did seem even, in the middle of the Iraq War, 2003, 2004, the Iraq story was up there. But it was really just up there with the Palestine story. It didn't supplant it per se. And I think the same can be said about Syria. It doesn't mean that, if I'm a Syrian, whether I care about the Palestinians or not, if I'm a Syrian involved in the civil war, and it's about living or dying tomorrow, I'm going to get the help of even the devil if I have to win. And in the same way, the Hezbollah or the Shia in Lebanon were in some ways happy to see the PLO defeated in some cases in the south. And of course they turned and became against Israel, as what happened in Iraq as well. So I think the story of Palestine is far more complex, because it's not just about how people rank it. It is also in this era where, yes, people are preoccupied with their things. If there's anything that would summarize what is the driving force of the uprisings, I'd say you'd have to say the drive for dignity. And I say the drive for dignity is complex. Of course, it includes economics, it includes relations with the rulers, it also includes relations with the rest of the world. Palestine has been the symbol of humiliation that the Arabs seek to overcome. That's number one. And number two, if you look at what Arabs want to see in this world now, what is it that they want to see? They want to see Arab empowerment. They don't want to be humiliated not only at home, but in the relations with the outside world. And if you look at this relationship between Israel and Palestine, if the Palestinian-Israeli conflict isn't resolved, how do they see Israel? Israel sees itself as a country that is going to have the option of winning war against any combination of Arabs and having technological superiority over them. They see it as a survival arithmetic when you don't have a solution. And the US supports them on that. If you're looking at it from the point of view of a liberated Arab and listening to that, the fact that you have a country of 8 million wants to dominate 500 million Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East and feels that it needs that for its security, that rubs against the very notion of what people are striving to achieve. So yes, in the short term, they're preoccupied. And what works also against the Palestine question is, in some ways, it's now, there is no eruption that mobilizes people. But you can bet things will change, and they had in the past. We've heard that story before. Things have moved to the Gulf. Iraq has moved to the back. The Palestine issue has moved to the background, and I think it always finds its way to the forefront of the issues.
All right, well, Shibley Telhami, thank you for joining us. The World Through Arab Eyes, Shibley's new book, and thanks for joining POMEPS.
My pleasure.